The forest near Hurtgen was a cathedral of silence, broken only by the crack of branches beneath heavy boots and the distant thunder of artillery rolling like an angry god beyond the hills. Snow had fallen for 3 days straight, blanketing the corpses that littered the ground, erasing the line between the living and the dead. The air was bitter and metallic, filled with the lingering scent of gunpowder and blood. Private Thomas Miller moved through it like a ghost, his uniform torn, his face caked with mud, his right arm bound tightly with a piece of his own shirt to stop the bleeding. He had lost his rifle somewhere in the chaos that morning, when his platoon was ambushed in a narrow valley were ordered to. Most of them didn't make it. The rest were probably captured or scattered, hiding among the ruins of what used to be a quiet stretch of forest between the German lines and the front held by the Americans. He didn't know anymore which direction was home. Every tree looked the same. Every shadow whispered danger. Every echo sounded like death. He had been walking for hours, though time had ceased to mean anything. His breath came out in short bursts of vapor that disappeared into the freezing air. Somewhere behind him, machine gun fire rattled in brief bursts, distant enough to be ignored, yet close enough to remind him he was still deep in enemy territory. His legs trembled with exhaustion, and the dull pain in his shoulder pulsed in rhythm with his heartbeat. He thought of water, warmth, and his mother's kitchen back in Pennsylvania, the smell of coffee, the crackle of the stove, the safety of sounds that no longer existed anywhere on this side of the ocean. But the war had a way of turning every comforting memory into torture. The harder he tried to remember home, the more the forest closed in, reminding him that home was a place he might never see again. By the time he reached the clearing, the world had grown silent again. He stopped, leaning against a tree, trying to steady his breath. The stillness felt wrong. Even the birds were gone. He sensed eyes on him, that predatory stillness that came right before violence. He looked around, but saw nothing, just snow and smoke, and the faint outlines of broken helmets poking from the ground. Then a sound, metal against metal, a rifle bolt being drawn. Thomas froze. His heart slammed against his ribs. He turned slowly, eyes scanning the trees, and saw him. Sergeant Heinrich Kruger stood about 30 yards away, his figure half hidden by a fallen pine. The German's uniform was streaked with soot and snow, his helmet dented, his face gaunt and pale beneath the grime of battle. He was holding a Kar 98K rifle, aimed squarely at Thomas. For a few seconds, they didn't move. The world seemed to narrow until there was nothing but the two of them. One standing, one barely standing, both too tired to understand why they were still fighting. Heinrich's finger hovered over the trigger. He had been given orders: shoot every enemy you find. No prisoners, no mercy. Orders were simple, and simplicity was all that kept him alive. But as he looked at the man in front of him, his mind betrayed him. He saw not a soldier, but a reflection. Another man trapped in the same nightmare, wearing a different uniform, but carrying the same emptiness behind his eyes. The forest around them was dead quiet, yet both men could hear the pounding of their own hearts, the rhythmic sound of fear and exhaustion colliding in the cold air. Heinrich's breath fogged the air in front of him as he exhaled, steadying his aim. He could end it now, with one pull of the trigger. No one would ever know. No one would ever care. It was what he was supposed to do. But the barrel of the rifle began to tremble. Something deep inside him rebelled against the order, against the idea of killing a man who was already half dead. He thought of his brother, lost at Stalingrad, his mother's last letter, saying only, "Come home, my son, just come home." He thought of the young American's mother somewhere across the ocean, praying for the same. Thomas saw the gun rise, then hesitate. He expected the shot, the violent, merciful end that would end the hunger, the cold, the endless terror. But it didn't come. Instead, the German lowered the rifle slowly, his expression unreadable. He took a step forward, then another, his breath clouding the air between them. Thomas's lips trembled, too weak to raise his arms, too stunned to speak. When Heinrich stopped a few paces away, they locked eyes, two strangers connected by the strange, cruel mercy of war. Without a word, Heinrich lifted one hand, palm open, gesturing toward the west, the direction of the Allied lines. Thomas understood. His throat tightened as he nodded once, his eyes wet, but not from the cold. He turned, limping away, each step a defiance of everything the war was supposed to make them. Heinrich stood there for a long time after the American disappeared into the fog. He felt the weight of his rifle pressing against his hand like guilt, heavy and accusing. Around him, the forest remained still, indifferent. He sat down slowly beside the fallen tree, his body shaking from cold and from something deeper. a weariness of the soul. He lit a cigarette with trembling fingers, staring at the place where the man had vanished. The smoke rose and disappeared into the pale grey sky. In a war where humanity was forbidden, he had just committed an act of treason against his orders and against the darkness that had taken hold of him. But for the first time in years, Heinrich felt something close to peace. And somewhere out there, Thomas kept walking, bleeding and exhausted, carrying with him the memory of a man who should have killed him but didn't. The war would go on. Thousands more would die. But the frozen forest of Hurtgen would forever hold the echo of one impossible moment when mercy won, if only for a heartbeat. If you could feel that heartbeat, that fragile mercy in a world built on hate, tell me, where are you watching from? Thomas Miller was found 2 days later by a reconnaissance unit from the 121st Infantry, half conscious in a ditch near the edge of the Hurtgen forest. His body was frozen, his wound infected, and his mind lost somewhere between life and death. When they pulled him into the jeep, he tried to speak but couldn't find the words. He remembered fragments, the snow, the trees, the shadow of a man lowering his rifle. It felt like a dream, like something that couldn't have been real. At the field hospital, nurses cut away his uniform and whispered about how lucky he was to be alive. But Thomas didn't feel lucky. As the morphine blurred his thoughts, he saw Heinrich's face again and again, framed by the grey smoke of war, staring at him with eyes that seemed to carry the weight of every life lost on both sides. He wondered if the German had survived the next day, or if mercy had a price that couldn't be paid twice. When the war ended, Thomas went home to Pennsylvania. The flags waved, the streets filled with celebration, but he couldn't bring himself to join. The noise frightened him. The laughter felt like betrayal. People called him a hero, but he didn't feel like one. He carried an invisible wound, deeper than the scar on his shoulder. Every night, he woke drenched in sweat, seeing that same moment replaying in his dreams. The forest, the gun, the silence after mercy. Sometimes he wished the German had pulled the trigger, because then he wouldn't have to live with the unbearable gratitude of being spared. He tried to explain it once to his father, who'd fought in the Great War, but the old man only nodded and said, "You'll learn to forget." Thomas didn't. He never did. He married, had children, found work at a factory that built the kind of machines he used to destroy. He smiled when he was supposed to, but every quiet moment pulled him back to 1944. His wife would find him sitting on the porch long after midnight, staring at the tree line, as if expecting someone to emerge from it. Sometimes he wondered if the German still lived, if he had gone home, built a life, raised a son, and if so, did he ever think of the American he let go? The war had taken so much from both of them, yet it had given them one thing, a single shared secret that neither could tell. Meanwhile, Heinrich Krüger returned to a Germany that no longer resembled the country he had sworn to defend. The cities were rubble, the flags burned, and the orders he had followed so faithfully were now crimes whispered about in courtrooms. He walked for weeks trying to find what was left of his family. His father had died in the bombings. His brother's grave was somewhere east of the Dnieper. His mother, she was alive, but barely, her hands shaking when she touched his face for the first time in 6 years. "You came home," she whispered, but Heinrich couldn't answer. He didn't feel like he had. The war had hollowed him out. Every night, he thought of the man he had spared in the woods, wondering if mercy had been his only act of defiance or his final sin. Years passed, and life moved on, but the memory stayed sharp as the edge of his bayonet. He worked at a railway station, repairing the same tracks that had once carried soldiers to the front and prisoners to places no one returned from. He married a woman who couldn't understand why he refused to talk about the war. Sometimes she would find him sitting by the window in the dark, staring at nothing. When she asked what haunted him, he'd just shake his head and say, "A man I didn't kill." In that silence, she would turn away, unable to understand that for Heinrich, the absence of a single gunshot echoed louder than all the explosions he'd ever heard. Decades turned to dust. Both men grew old, their bodies bending under the weight of time, but that moment in the forest remained untouched, a frozen shard of humanity buried inside them. For Thomas, it was guilt and gratitude entwined. For Heinrich, it was redemption and shame. 2 lives forever shaped by 1 second of hesitation. Neither of them knew that fate was quietly drawing a circle, leading them back toward each other after nearly half a century. The world had changed, borders shifted, enemies became allies, and the children of soldiers no longer recognized the faces of war. Yet somewhere, deep down, both men knew that unfinished stories have a way of finding their own ending. If you've ever carried something from your past that still whispers in your nights, something you can't forget even after decades, then you'll understand why stories like this must be told. Subscribe now so you don't miss what happens when those two men finally meet again. By the time the spring of 1989 came, Thomas Miller was 70 years old, a man whose body had grown frail, but whose memories refused to fade. His house stood on the edge of a small Pennsylvania town, surrounded by the same pines that reminded him too much of Germany. His wife had passed a few winters before, leaving him in a house that felt too quiet for a man who had spent his youth surrounded by chaos. Every morning, he would sit by the window with his cup of black coffee and watch the fog roll in, as if waiting for ghosts to emerge from it. The war had ended 44 years ago, but for Thomas, it had never really stopped. It lived in the creak of the floorboards, in the whisper of the wind through the trees, in the silence of a world that had moved on without him. He often thought about that single moment in the forest, when death had been so close he could almost smell it, and then Mercy appeared wearing the face of an enemy. That face haunted him, not with fear, but with a strange tenderness. He didn't know if he hated or pitied the man who had spared him. Sometimes he even caught himself wondering if he should have gone back and looked for him after the war, though deep down, he knew that would have been impossible. On a grey morning in April, Thomas received a letter from a veterans organizer inviting him to a commemorative event in Aachen, Germany, a gathering of surviving soldiers from both sides of the Hurtgen campaign. He almost threw it away. The idea of returning to that soil, of breathing that air again, made his hands shake. But something in the letter lingered with him all day. Time heals what we let it. He had lived too long with wounds that never closed. That night, unable to sleep, he stared at his old service medal and thought of how strange it was that a piece of metal could outlive the men it honored. Before sunrise, he made up his mind. He would go. Maybe not to make peace with the war, but to make peace with himself. Meanwhile, across the ocean, in a small town near Cologne, Heinrich Krüger was living a life of quiet repetition. His hair was white now, his hands unsteady, his heart weakened by time, but still beating under the same burden. He spent his days repairing clocks in a small shop that smelled of oil and dust. It was ironic, he thought, to spend his last years fixing time when he had spent his youth trying to survive it. He had long stopped speaking of the war, even to his son, who knew only fragments, that his father had fought, that he never liked loud noises, and that sometimes he woke in the middle of the night speaking to someone who wasn't there. One afternoon, a local veterans association came to his door, asking if he would attend a meeting of reconciliation between former soldiers of both sides. Heinrich hesitated. For decades, he had avoided anything that might awaken the memories he had buried beneath layers of silence. But something in the invitation felt like a call, not from the living, but from the dead. Perhaps it was time, at last, to face what he had done and what he hadn't. The journey back to the forest was not measured in miles, but in heartbeat. Thomas landed in Germany under a grey sky that looked exactly as he remembered. The air smelled the same, cold, damp, heavy, with history. When the bus carrying the veterans crossed the border into the old battle region, he felt his chest tighten. He looked out the window and saw endless rows of trees, tall and skeletal, reaching toward the clouds like the hands of the fallen. The guide spoke about the battle, the statistic, the numbers, but Thomas heard none of it. All he could see was snow. All he could hear was the click of a rifle bolt echoing from 45 years ago. He pressed his palm against the glass and whispered something only he could understand. Heinrich arrived the same day, traveling by train. He hadn't been back to the Hurtgen since 1944. The closer he came, the more he felt like he was being drawn into a confession he had spent a lifetime avoiding. As he walked through the trees that morning, he stopped and placed his hand on the bark of an old pine. The wood was scarred, splintered by bullets that had never been dug out. He closed his eyes and heard the forest whisper. Sometimes he wondered if the dead still wandered here, trapped between forgiveness and memory. He thought of the American, the one whose name he never knew, and whispered a quiet apology to the air. That afternoon, the veterans gathered at a small stone memorial near the edge of the forest. Men in their 70s and 80s, their uniforms replaced by worn suits and heavy coats, their eyes holding the same haunted look they'd carried since they were 20. Thomas stood near the back, listening as a German official spoke about reconciliation, about forgiveness, about how time turns enemies into teachers. The words felt heavy but hollow. Forgiveness wasn't something spoken, it was something lived, and for him, it had lived in the silence of a man who hadn't pulled the trigger. When the ceremony ended, people began to mingle, shaking hands, sharing photographs, speaking in broken English and German. Thomas wandered away from the crowd, drawn by something deeper than curiosity. He walked toward the tree line, where the forest began again. His cane sank slightly into the soft ground, and for a moment he forgot the years. The air was cold and familiar. Then he heard a voice behind him, a voice cracked with age, but unmistakably human, speaking softly in accented English. "That's where you stood." Thomas turned, his breath catching in his throat. A man stood a few yards away, silver-haired, wearing a long coat and holding a small hat in his hand. His eyes were the same. He didn't need to ask. He knew. Neither spoke for several seconds. The air between them carried 45 years of silence. Heinrich took a step forward, his voice trembling as he said, "I never thought I would see you again." Thomas swallowed hard, feeling his heart pounding against the weight of time. "I never forgot you," he said quietly. The wind moved through the trees, as if the forest itself had been waiting for this moment. Two old men, once enemies, now the last witnesses to their own shared act of mercy, stood facing each other in the same woods where they should have died. The war was over, but this was peace. For a long moment, neither man moved. The wind drifted through the trees like a sigh, carrying with it the scent of pine and distant rain. It was as if the forest itself remembered them, two survivors returning to the place that had nearly devoured them. Thomas stood still, leaning on his cane, the old scar on his shoulder throbbing faintly in the cold air. Heinrich, his hat trembling slightly in his hand, lowered his gaze to the ground as if standing in front of a grave. He wanted to speak, but could not find the word. There were no words large enough to hold what 45 years of silence had carried. At last, Thomas broke it. "You didn't kill me," he said softly, his voice rasped by age and emotion. "All my life I've wondered why." Heinrich looked up, his eyes glistening, and for the first time Thomas saw that the same question had haunted him too. Heinrich stepped closer, each movement deliberate, cautious, as though afraid that the past might shatter if he moved too quickly. "I don't know," he said. "That day, when I saw you, I saw myself. I had followed every order, done everything they told me to, but that morning, something inside me broke. Maybe it was God, maybe it was exhaustion, maybe I was just too tired to kill another man." He paused, breathing heavily, as the memories flooded back. "I remember the snow on your face. You were bleeding, you looked like a boy. My rifle was ready and I should have shot, but I couldn't. I thought, if I do this, there will be nothing left of me to take home, so I let you go." His voice cracked. "And I spent the rest of my life wondering if you made it out. Sometimes when the trains passed my house at night, I thought I could hear your footsteps walking away in the snow." Thomas's eyes filled with tears that he did not bother to hide. "I made it out," he said quietly. "Barely. I was found 2 days later by my own men. They said it was a miracle. I told them there was a German who had spared me, but no one believed me. They said I was delirious. But I remembered your face. Every night. Sometimes I hated you for letting me live, because I didn't know what to do with that gift. I tried to bury it, but it always came back." He looked around the forest, the trees rising like sentinels over their shared past. "I came here because I needed to see if you were real, if that moment was real, and now I know it was." Heinrich nodded slowly, his eyes clouded with something between sorrow and relief. "It was real," he said. "More real than anything else in that war. After it ended, I thought about turning myself in. I thought that maybe what I had done was wrong, that I had betrayed my comrades, my orders, my country. But as the years passed, I understood it was the only right thing I ever did. It was the only moment when I felt human again." His voice trembled, the words barely above a whisper. "I am sorry for everything else, for every man who didn't make it out, for every order I followed, for every bullet I fired that I can't take back." Thomas shook his head. "You don't owe me an apology. We were both trapped in something bigger than ourselves. You saved me that day, but maybe you saved yourself too." He stepped forward, closing the distance between them. The two men stood face to face, close enough to see the lines carved by time and guilt across each other's faces. Thomas extended his hand. Heinrich hesitated for a heartbeat, then took it. The grip was firm, trembling with the weight of years. For a second, the forest seemed to hold its breath. Two enemies who should have killed each other stood there in silence, hand in hand, as the ghosts of their youth watched from the tree. Heinrich's lips trembled. "All these years, I wondered what you would say if we ever met again." Thomas smiled faintly, his eyes glistening. "I would say thank you." The words hung in the cold air like a prayer. Heinrich closed his eyes, and for the first time since the war ended, he felt something lift from his chest. It wasn't absolution, not completely, but it was peace, fragile and real. He looked at Thomas again and said quietly, "You were the only good memory I took from that war." Thomas nodded. "And you were the only mercy I ever found in it." They sat down together on a fallen tree, the same way soldiers once sat between battles, their shoulders brushing lightly. For a long time neither spoke. They simply breathed the same air, shared the same silence, as if both understood that no words could undo what had been done. The forest around them whispered softly, the branches swaying like tired old men bowing their heads. In that silence, there was no war, no sides, no orders, only two lives that had once crossed at the edge of death, now finding each other again in the twilight of their years. As the sun dipped behind the trees, casting long golden streaks through the forest, Heinrich said, almost to himself, "I spent my life fixing clocks, trying to make them run again. But time doesn't really move forward, does it? It circles back." Thomas looked at him and said, "Maybe it circles back until we understand." Heinrich smiled faintly, the corners of his eyes wet. "Then maybe today we understand." They stayed there until the light faded completely, until the forest swallowed the day and left them in soft darkness. The past, at last, had been met face to face. If you've ever carried something for decades, a memory, a guilt, a mercy you couldn't name, tell me in the comments. Do you think forgiveness finds us, or do we have to find it ourselves? Copy and share your answer below. I want to read it. They didn't speak much as they walked back toward the small memorial where the other veterans were gathering for the evening's closing ceremony. The forest behind them had swallowed decades of ghosts, leaving only the two of them walking side by side in the fading light, two silhouettes crossing the same ground where their younger selves had once faced death. There was something almost sacred in the silence that surrounded them now, something that made words feel unnecessary. Every step felt like a lifetime, every glance like the completion of an unfinished prayer. When they reached the edge of the clearing, Thomas turned one last time to look back. The pines were dark now, their tops bending slightly in the cold wind. He thought of all the men still lying somewhere beneath those trees, both American and German, men who had died believing they were enemies. He wondered what it meant that two of them had lived long enough to shake hands. That night, Thomas lay in his hotel bed staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. He could still feel the warmth of Heinrich's hand in his own, and it stirred something inside him that he hadn't felt in decades, a kind of peace that wasn't loud or triumphant, but quiet, simple, like the steady rhythm of a heart finally slowing after years of battle. He realized that for all the time he'd spent trying to forget the war, he had been clinging to it in ways he didn't understand. The fear, the guilt, the memory of that single act of mercy, it had become the definition of his life. He thought that maybe, in forgiving Heinrich, he had also forgiven himself for surviving. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in years, the forest in his dreams wasn't filled with snow and blood. It was filled with light. In his own small house outside Cologne, Heinrich sat alone at his kitchen table, the invitation to the veterans' gathering lying open before him. He traced the edges of the paper with his fingers, as if feeling the weight of something invisible pressed against it. He had never expected to meet Thomas again. The war had ended, but his private sentence had never been lifted. Now, after all these years, that meeting had released him from it, not by erasing what he had done, but by proving that mercy was not weakness, it was strength. It had always been strength. He poured himself a glass of schnapps, lifted it slightly toward the night, and whispered, "For the ones who didn't come home." Then, after a long pause, "And for the one who did." The wind rattled softly against the window. He could almost hear the faint crunch of footsteps in snow, the sound of a man walking away, still alive, still human. In the days that followed, they exchanged letters, short, simple notes written in the shaky handwriting of men whose hands had grown old. They didn't talk about politics or armies or the old divisions that had once ruled the world. They talked about their children, their wives, their gardens, the ache in their knees when the weather changed. It was strange how easily they could write to each other after all those years. The words came naturally, as if they were brothers who had simply been apart too long. Each letter carried something the other needed, understanding. They never mentioned the day in the forest again. They didn't have to. That day was carved into both of them, not as a scar, but as proof that even in the darkest corners of history, something human had survived. Months passed, and then years. They grew older still. Thomas's hands began to shake too much to hold a pen, and Heinrich's eyesight dimmed, forcing his son to read the letters to him aloud. Both men knew time was running out, but they no longer feared it. They had seen death once before, and it had looked away. When Thomas turned 78, his youngest granddaughter asked him during a family gathering, "Grandpa, Were you scared in the war? He smiled softly and said, once I was. Then someone taught me not to be. He didn't say who, and she didn't ask again. But that night, as he watched her fall asleep on the couch, he whispered to the quiet room, thank you, Heinrich. One winter morning, a letter arrived from Germany. It wasn't written in Heinrich's shaky hand. It was from his son. Heinrich had passed away peacefully in his sleep. Thomas sat at his table for a long time, reading the letter again and again, the ink blurring as tears filled his eyes. He folded it carefully, placed it in his breast pocket, and went outside. The air was cold, and the first flakes of snow were falling. He looked up, watching the sky, and for a moment, he could almost see the forest again. The same grey light, the same silence. Somewhere far away, two young men faced each other across a clearing, and mercy lived once more. The snow settled gently on his shoulders, and Thomas smiled through his tears. He whispered to the sky. He stood there for a while, letting the cold sting his face, feeling the strange peace of knowing that both of them had finally made it home, not to the places they came from, but to the small, quiet corner of the human heart, where forgiveness lives forever. If you've ever felt the weight of something you didn't know how to forgive, yourself, someone else, or the world, remember this. Sometimes forgiveness doesn't arrive with words. Sometimes it comes quietly, like snow, and you only recognize it when it lands on you. Time did not so much pass for Thomas Miller as it folded in on itself, looping endlessly between what was and what would never be again. In the quiet years after Heinrich's death, the world around him seemed to grow smaller, while his memories grew larger, filling every room, every silence, every sleepless night. His hair had turned the color of snow. His hands were frail and spotted, yet when he touched the old letters, stacked neatly in their wooden box, he felt young again, 20 years old, lost in a frozen forest, staring into the eyes of a man who had chosen not to kill him. The box sat on the mantel beside an old photograph of his wife and the folded flag from his service. He often wondered which memory would fade first, her voice or the sound of the forest. He hoped it would be neither. He lived a life of gentle repetition. Every morning began the same way, coffee brewed too strong, a piece of toast he never finished, the newspaper trembling slightly in his hands. The news spoke of new wars in faraway lands, of nations divided again, of young men once more sent to fight for reasons that would fade by the time they were old enough to question them. Thomas would shake his head, fold the paper, and stare out the window. The pines beyond his yard swayed under the wind, whispering in a language only he seemed to understand. They never learn, he would mutter softly, his voice trembling but steady. To anyone else it would sound like the rambling of an old veteran, but Thomas wasn't talking to him. He was talking to Heinrich, to the ghost, to the snow. The seasons moved gently around. Spring brought the smell of wet earth and lilacs. Summer filled his garden with tomatoes and wildflowers that reminded him of home. Autumn painted the ground in gold and red, but it was winter that always called to him. When the first snow fell, he would wrap himself in his old army coat and walk down the narrow path behind his house, his cane crunching softly against the frozen ground. He'd stop where the trees grew thickest, close his eyes, and listen. In the silence between the falling flakes, he could still hear it, the faint click of a rifle bolt, the slow breath of fear, the heartbeat that refused to stop. He would whisper into the cold, "We made it, didn't we?" And sometimes, in the quiet that followed, he thought he could hear an answer drifting through the air. Yes, we did. His children visited often, though they could never quite understand the stillness that surrounded him. To them, the war was something printed in textbook, black and white photographs of strangers. But to Thomas, it was color, sound, smell. It was the weight of mud on his boots, the sting of snow against his face, the impossible mercy of a man whose name the world would never know. He told his story only once, years earlier, to his eldest son, who had asked him why he kept an old German pocket knife in his desk drawer. "Because it reminds me," Thomas said, "that even in war, there are men who choose not to hate." He never spoke of it again, but his son remembered every word. Some nights, when sleep came slowly, Thomas would sit in his armchair and reread Heinrich's letters. The paper was thin, creased from too much folding, but he treated each sheet like something holy. They didn't speak of guilt or repentance. They spoke of gardens, grandchildren, the ache of old bones, the slow miracle of peace. Heinrich's handwriting had grown unsteady in the final years, and one of his last letters ended with a line that Thomas could never forget. "The forest forgave us before we forgave ourselves." That line lived inside him like a soft light, something he carried quietly wherever he went. As his body grew weaker, his mind became clearer, as though everything he had ever run from was now waiting patiently for him to see it differently. He realized that mercy had not just saved his life, it had shaped it. Every decision he made afterward, every act of kindness, every time he held his tongue instead of raising his voice, had been because of that single moment. He often wondered if Heinrich had known that by sparing him, he had started a ripple that reached far beyond the two of them. Perhaps that was what redemption really was. Not forgiveness, but continuation. One winter morning, when the sky was low and grey and the air tasted like snow, Thomas went for his walk later than usual. The cold bit into his hands, but he didn't care. He made his way down the familiar path, slower than before, each step deliberate and fragile. The trees loomed ahead, their dark trunks standing like silent witnesses. He stopped by one that reminded him of the fallen pine in Hürtgen, placed a trembling hand on its bark, and closed his eyes. The wind moved softly around him, and he could almost hear footsteps beside him, the echo of boots in snow, steady, patient. He whispered, "You kept your promise," and smiled. For a moment, he wasn't old. He was young again, standing in the forest, breathing, alive. When his daughter found him later that afternoon, he was sitting on the bench by the tree, his coat dusted with snow, his head tilted slightly upward as if he'd been listening to something far away. His cane lay at his feet. There was no fear in his face, only calm. The kind of calm that comes when a man has finally set down the weight he's carried all his life. In his coat pocket, she found a folded photograph of two old men standing together in front of a line of pines, and beneath it, a small piece of paper with handwriting so faded it was barely legible. It was Heinrich's final line, "The forest forgave us before we forgave ourselves." At the funeral, the pastor spoke of mercy, of how the smallest act can outlive us, changing lives we'll never see. As the casket was lowered, snow began to fall, slow, soft, endless. The guests fell silent, watching as the flakes gathered on the fresh earth. It was as if the forest itself had come to lay its hand upon one last. Somewhere far beyond, where time and memory meet, two young soldiers walked again through the snow, not as enemies, but as brothers. If you've ever carried something heavy, something that haunted you but also taught you who you are, hold this story close. Because mercy, real mercy, doesn't vanish. It echoes through time, through generations, until even the snow learns to forgive. Years passed after Thomas Miller's death, yet the story of what had happened in that forest refused to disappear. It began as a whisper among his family, something told in pieces and fragments. The mysterious German who had spared him, the letters, the final walk in the snow. His daughter kept the wooden box on her mantel, the same one her father had guarded for half a century. Inside were the letters, the photograph, and a small rusted pocket engraved with initials that time had nearly erased. H.K. When visitors came, she would sometimes open the box carefully, as if afraid the memories might crumble to dust, and tell them, "This was my father's friend. He saved him during the war." The guests would nod politely, not quite understanding the weight of it. How could they? They hadn't lived through it. They hadn't seen mercy bloom in a place built for death. But she knew, her children would know, and their children after them. That, she decided, was how mercy survives, passed quietly from hand to hand, generation to generation, like a fragile flame that refuses to go out. The story reached further than the family. A local historian, collecting veterans' letters for an archive, came across Thomas's correspondence with Heinrich. The historian read them one by one, unable to stop, feeling something stir inside him. There were no confessions, no politics, no mention of battle, only two men who had once faced each other across a rifle sight and somehow found humanity instead. He wrote an article about it for a small journal, calling it "The Silence in the Snow." It spread quietly through veteran circles, then through newspapers, until it found its way into classrooms and documentary. The world, so often starved of compassion, seemed to need the reminder that even in its darkest hours, kindness had existed. A moment of mercy had become a lesson in what it means to be human. Decades later, in the same forest where it had all begun, a small bronze plaque was placed near the clearing. It bore no names, only words. "To those who chose mercy over war." The trees around it had grown tall and thick again, their roots wrapped around the remains of the old battlefield, turning the scars of war into quiet soil. Sometimes hikers passed the plaque without noticing it, but those who did often stopped in silence. A few would leave something small behind, a coin, a wildflower, a folded note that said, "Thank you." They didn't need to know the names. The act itself was enough. If you stood there on a cold morning, you could almost feel it, the weight of history lifting, the breath of the forest, the memory of two men frozen forever in a moment of grace. The wind would move through the trees, and if you listened closely, you might swear you could hear footsteps, the sound of a man walking away from death, the sound of another lowering his rifle, the sound of forgiveness carried by snow. Some stories end with victory, others end with loss, but this one ends with something rarer, with understanding. In a world that keeps finding new ways to destroy itself, the smallest kindness can echo louder than any weapon. Mercy is not weakness, it is defiance. It is the choice to be human when everything around you demands otherwise. That is what Thomas and Heinrich left behind. Not medals, not monuments, but proof that even in hell there can be light. And if you're here, listening to their story now, maybe you carry something like it too. A moment that shaped you, a mercy you can't forget. If this story reached you, if it reminded you that compassion outlives conflict, then keep it alive. Like this story, share it, subscribe to the channel. Let mercy keep, because somewhere, in the silence of every forest, it still does.